Before the sun rose, before church bells called the faithful, before the town even breathed, the knight was already awake. Not because he wanted to be. Because if he wasn't, he could die. This is the first lie about knights. Most people believe that their lives were filled with glory, banners, and applause. In reality, a knight's day began the same way, every day, without exception, with pain, discipline, and routine so strict it erased choice itself. A knight did not decide how to live. His life was decided for him long before he ever touched a sword. From the moment he opened his eyes, his body belonged to his duty. He rose from a hard bed, often nothing more than straw or wool stretched over wooden boards. Comfort was considered weakness. Warmth was earned, not given. Even noble-born knights were expected to endure discomfort daily, because war never waited for comfort. The first task was always the same: inspection of the body. Bruises from training. Calluses torn open. Stiff joints from yesterday's armor. A knight learned to read his own pain like a map. Pain was not an enemy, it was information. Ignore it, and it would end you when steel met steel. Then came prayer. Even the most hardened knights prayed. Not always out of faith, sometimes out of habit, sometimes fear. A knight lived with the constant understanding that death could arrive before sunset. Confession was not a ritual, it was insurance. Only after prayer did the real work begin. Training was not optional, it was survival. Contrary to popular belief, knights did not train sometimes. They trained every single day. Not heroic duels. Not dramatic sword fights. Endless repetition. Wooden swords first, heavy ones, deliberately heavier than real blades. Swinging them built muscle and endurance. Miss a swing, and the instructor corrected you immediately. Sometimes with words. Sometimes with the flat of a stick. Discipline was physical because battle was physical. Then came shield drills. Holding a shield looks easy, until you are ordered not to lower it for an hour. Knights trained their arms to burn and keep going anyway. In battle, lowering a shield for a second meant a blade through the throat. Footwork followed. Knights learned to move in armor, not around it. Armor weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms, and every step mattered. Trip once, and you were finished. Many knights died on battlefields without a single wound, crushed under the weight of their own armor after falling. Training included wrestling, grappling, and ground combat. A knight who lost his sword was expected to fight anyway. Elbows, knees, fists, nothing was forbidden in survival. There was no cheering. No applause. Only breath, sweat, and repetition. Armor was a daily companion, not a costume. Armor was not worn only in war or tournaments. Knights practiced putting it on quickly, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes in the dark. Speed mattered. Panic killed. Each piece had to be checked. Straps tight. Buckles secure. No rust. No cracked metal. A broken strap could expose the neck. A cracked plate could split under impact. Knights often maintained their own armor because trusting another man with your protection was dangerous. Armor also punished the body. It pinched, rubbed skin raw, trapped heat. Knights trained in it specifically so their bodies adapted. Removing armor after training revealed bruises shaped exactly like the metal that caused them. Meals were fuel, not pleasure. Food was not glamorous. Bread, cheese, porridge, occasionally meat, wine or weak ale more often than water. Knights ate to function, not to enjoy. Overeating made you slow. Undereating made you weak. There were rules even here. A knight was expected to eat with restraint. Gluttony was seen as a flaw in character. Discipline at the table mirrored discipline on the field. A knight was always being watched. Even outside training, a knight was never off duty. How he walked, how he spoke, how he treated servants, peasants, other knights. Reputation mattered almost as much as skill. A knight who behaved poorly could lose patronage. Without a lord's support, armor went unrepaired, horses unfed, weapons dulled. Many skilled knights faded into obscurity not because they were weak, but because they failed socially. Honor was not abstract. It was economic survival. The horse was not a tool, it was a partner. Every knight cared for his horse personally. Not because it was noble, but because no one else would do it correctly. A warhorse cost more than a small house. It was trained to charge into chaos, ignore noise, screams, and impact. If the horse panicked, the knight died. Cleaning hooves. checking legs, feeding properly, training the horse daily. A knight learned to read the animal's mood the same way he read his own body. Injuries were hidden until too late. And then, preparation for what might come. After training, maintenance, and obligations, the knight prepared for the unknown. A tournament. A summons from his lord. A sudden march. A conflict that would erase weeks of routine in a single afternoon. Knights lived in a state of permanent readiness. Plans were fragile. Certainty was an illusion. And as the sun lowered, as townspeople relaxed and families gathered, the knight cleaned his weapons one more time, not because he expected to use them, but because a knight who hoped for peace still prepared for war. This was not glory. This was endurance. And this was only the beginning. Knights did not fear battle the way people imagine. What truly haunted them was the tournament field, because unlike war it was watched, judged, remembered, and every mistake followed a man for the rest of his life. Tournaments were sold to the public as celebration and sport, but to a knight they were controlled chaos where reputation could be built or erased in minutes. A knight entered the lists knowing every movement would be seen by lords, rivals, patrons, and potential enemies. There was no hiding weakness, no retreat without shame, and no forgiveness for failure. Tournaments were not friendly games but rehearsals for war where real injuries were common and death was an accepted risk even if rarely spoken aloud. The armor was real. The horses were real, the impact was real, and weapons though blunted still broke bones, crushed ribs, and ended careers in seconds. Many knights preferred actual warfare because in battle chaos hid mistakes while tournaments exposed them. Before a tournament a knight's day began earlier than usual, armor polished not for protection but for appearance, heraldry inspected because symbols mattered, colors spoke louder than words and announced lineage, alliances, grudges, and ambition. A knight's banner could invite friendship or provoke hatred before the first strike was thrown. The psychological pressure was immense because tournaments were not just tests of strength but tests of identity. A knight who lost badly could be mocked in song, whispered about in halls, and quietly abandoned by patrons who preferred winners. This fear shaped behavior in subtle ways. Knights trained harder before tournaments, slept less, prayed more. Some became obsessively careful, others reckless, believing boldness could mask fatigue. Rivalries often formed not from hatred but from necessity because defeating a known opponent meant more recognition than beating an unknown one. Knights studied each other constantly, watching how a rival held a lance, how he turned his horse, how he recovered after impact. Information was power and gossip was a weapon. Outside the lists social battles continued. Knights were expected to behave perfectly in public. Too quiet and you seemed weak, too loud and you seemed foolish. One careless insult could trigger a formal challenge, not out of anger but obligation. Honor demanded response even when common sense advised restraint. This constant performance exhausted men as deeply as physical training. Every smile was calculated, every word measured. Knights learned to speak in half-statements and controlled silences. The evening before a tournament was often the worst. Sleep came poorly, armor waited nearby like a reminder. Some knights sharpened weapons they would not use simply to calm their minds. Others sat alone rehearsing movements until dawn, and when the tournament began there was no time to think, only to act. The charge erased doubt and replaced it with instinct. Afterward came judgment. Applause or silence, invitations or avoidance. A knight returned to daily life carrying invisible weight heavier than armor, because reputation lingered long after bruises faded, and yet despite fear and pressure tournaments remained central to a knight's existence. They were gateways to wealth, land, marriage, and influence. A single successful season could change a man's future while a single failure could quietly end it. Knights understood this balance intimately and lived with the knowledge that glory was not a gift but a risk taken publicly, repeatedly, without guarantees, and this constant tension shaped how knights trained, spoke, ate, and slept, because in their world being seen was often more dangerous than being struck, and surviving the eyes of others required as much discipline as surviving the blade. When training ended and tournaments faded into memory, the knight did not become free. Daily life outside combat was not rest but another form of discipline shaped by expectation and constant readiness. A knight lived inside a social cage built from honor, loyalty, and obligation. Every day involved service to a lord, whether through guarding roads, managing land, escorting messengers, or acting as visible authority in places where law was thin and fear traveled faster than justice. Knights were Often judges in disputes they did not create and enforcers of rules they did not write. Their presence alone was meant to prevent trouble, yet it often attracted it. Peasants watched carefully because a knight's mood could decide the outcome of an argument, a favor granted, or a punishment enforced. This power carried risk because cruelty damaged reputation while softness invited challenge. Balance was everything and few mastered it. Knights were expected to be controlled, calm, and decisive. Even when exhausted or injured, their speech was measured because words could escalate situations faster than weapons. Beyond public duty came constant preparation. Weapons were cleaned daily, not out of ritual but necessity. Rust killed just as effectively as negligence. Swords were inspected, edges aligned, grips replaced, and scabbards repaired because failure in equipment meant failure in survival. Horses required the same attention. A knight's bond with his horse deepened outside battle. Where trust was built slowly through repetition, training rides reinforced control while exposure to noise and crowds reduced panic. A frightened horse could end a career instantly. Evenings were often filled with instruction of squires, teaching by repetition rather than explanation. Young boys learned through watching mistakes and receiving correction without comfort. Kindness was rare because the world they were being prepared for was not kind. Knights were also expected to attend feasts and gatherings where their role shifted from warrior to symbol. How they sat, when they spoke, who they acknowledged all mattered. These events were political terrain disguised as celebration. Alliances were formed over cups while rivalries simmered quietly. A knight who drank too much or spoke carelessly could undo years of careful service. Restraint was another battlefield. Nights were often spent planning for futures that might never arrive. Land grants promised, marriages arranged, campaigns rumored, nothing certain until it happened. Sleep came light because readiness was ingrained. Armor often lay within reach, weapons never far. Even in peace, knights understood that peace was temporary. Banditry, rebellion, and feuds erupted without warning. Messengers could arrive at dawn with orders that erased routine and demanded immediate departure. This uncertainty shaped the knight's psychology deeply. They learned not to grow attached to place or stability. Belongings were minimal and portable. Relationships were cautious. Hope was restrained. Beneath the surface discipline lay constant tension. Many knights carried injuries that never healed fully, aches ignored, fatigue normalized, emotional strain hidden behind composure. There was no language for doubt or fear. Expressing weakness threatened identity itself, so knights endured silently, adapting, hardening, surviving one ordinary day at a time. And though songs celebrated moments of victory, the truth was quieter and heavier. Most of a knight's life passed without glory, filled instead with duty repeated endlessly, unseen by history but essential to survival. A knight's body was not trained for moments of brilliance but for endless repetition that slowly reshaped bone, muscle, and instinct. Every movement drilled until thought disappeared. Mornings returned again and again to the same exercises because consistency mattered more than intensity. Striking posts hardened wrists, lifting stones strengthened grip, running in armor forced lungs to adapt to weight and heat. Knights trained exhaustion deliberately because battles never waited for rest. Pain became background noise rather than warning. Joints cracked, fingers stiffened, old injuries reopened without ceremony. There was no concept of recovery as understood today. Rest was viewed with suspicion and idleness as weakness. A knight who complained risked losing trust, so most learned to function while injured, binding limbs tightly and continuing regardless. This culture created warriors capable of enduring extreme strain but also shortened careers quietly. Many knights became less mobile by middle age, their bodies bearing the cost of years of discipline. Training also extended beyond physical movement into reflex and awareness. Knights practiced reacting to sudden noise, unexpected contact, and visual confusion. Shields struck from behind, commands shouted mid-motion, horses turned abruptly to simulate chaos. Surprise was rehearsed until it lost its edge. Sparring partners were rotated constantly to prevent familiarity. No knight wanted to face only predictable opponents. Weapons training covered more than swords. Axes, maces, and daggers were practiced because battle stripped choice quickly. A knight who lost his primary weapon had seconds to adapt. Grappling was emphasized because combat often collapsed into close contact where strength and balance mattered more than reach. The ground was considered the most dangerous place. Knights trained relentlessly to avoid falling and to rise immediately if forced down. Armor amplified danger here. Once pinned, movement became limited and panic lethal. This reality shaped training priorities far more than dramatic duels ever did. conditioning extended into daily habits, posture was corrected constantly, slouching was discouraged because it weakened balance, even walking was observed and adjusted. Knights learned to move efficiently to conserve energy. Breathing patterns were practiced unconsciously until controlled breathing became automatic under stress. Diet reinforced training goals. Food choices were simple and repetitive. Excess was discouraged because weight slowed reaction. Hydration mattered but was poorly understood, so many knights relied on weak ale or watered wine. Long-term health suffered quietly. Knights brought no true rest because muscles remained tense. Sleep was shallow and interrupted. Dreams often replayed movements rather than memories. Despite this grinding routine, knights found identity in mastery. Small improvements mattered: a cleaner strike, steadier balance, faster mount. Progress was measured privately because praise was rare. Instructors offered correction far more often than approval. This harsh environment produced competence through attrition. Only those who adapted remained. Others faded into support roles or disappeared from records entirely. Training never truly ended because survival demanded constant readiness. Even aging knights practiced daily at reduced intensity, aware that rust in skill was as dangerous as rust on steel. This lifelong discipline forged resilience but demanded sacrifice that few outside the world of knighthood ever fully understood. A knight's life was not guided by strength alone but by a framework of belief and obligation that shaped every decision. Faith was woven into routine, not always through devotion but through expectation. Prayer marked beginnings and endings because uncertainty surrounded everything a knight did. Battle could arrive without warning and confession was treated as preparation rather than reflection. Many knights believed survival depended as much on spiritual alignment as physical readiness, yet faith also served as structure, giving meaning to hardship that otherwise felt endless. Duty to a lord formed the core of identity. Loyalty was not optional but contractual and personal. Breaking it carried social and material consequences that extended beyond the individual. A knight's reputation traveled faster than he did. Word of disobedience could close doors permanently. Service involved more than fighting. Knights collected rents, enforced laws, escorted officials, guarded borders, and represented authority in regions where systems were fragile. This constant visibility created pressure because mistakes were magnified. Favoritism angered communities, strictness bred resentment, and neutrality was rarely possible. Knights learned to navigate tension carefully. Their authority depended on appearing controlled and decisive. Hesitation invited challenge, overreaction invited conflict. Beyond public responsibility lay private burden. Many knights supported households that depended entirely on their service. Armor repairs, horse feed, weapon maintenance, and clothing all cost money. Tournaments promised reward but demanded investment. Debt was common and often hidden. A knight who failed financially could lose equipment and status quickly. This economic strain influenced choices on and off the field. Risk was calculated constantly. Marriage was rarely romantic. Unions were arranged to secure land or alliances. Affection might grow later but was never guaranteed. Time spent away from home was frequent and prolonged. Campaigns and service separated families for months or years. Communication was unreliable. Absence became normal. Emotional distance often followed. Knights learned to compartmentalize attachment because distraction was dangerous. Despite this, many felt strong obligation to protect communities under their charge, even when gratitude was absent. Peasants might fear or resent knights but still depended on them during unrest. This dynamic created isolation. A knight stood between groups but fully belonged to none. Evenings were often spent in quiet maintenance and reflection. Weapons cleaned, armor repaired, plans reviewed. Silence filled spaces where celebration was absent. The absence of action could be as heavy as battle itself. Waiting bred tension. Rumors of conflict stirred anticipation and dread simultaneously. Knights prepared mentally for outcomes they could not control. Success brought recognition but also new expectations. Failure lingered without forgiveness. Faith offered comfort but also guilt. Survival when others fell raised questions few voiced aloud. Over time, this accumulation of responsibility shaped knights into restrained individuals whose calm demeanor masked constant calculation. They were not fearless but practiced at moving forward despite uncertainty. Duty became habit and habit became identity. By the time a knight reached maturity, the role was inseparable from the person. Stepping away meant losing purpose as much as status. This quiet weight defined knighthood more than any moment of spectacle. Time did not spare knights, it simply slowed them until the world began to move faster than they could follow. aging in knighthood was not marked by ceremony but by subtle changes that only the knight noticed at first: slower recovery after training, stiffness that lasted longer each morning, a hesitation before mounting that never used to exist. Strength remained but sharpness dulled. And in a world built on readiness even small delays mattered. Older knights trained differently not because they wanted to but because their bodies demanded it. Intensity lowered while precision became priority, technique replaced force, experience compensated for fading speed. Many became instructors and advisors, passing down knowledge earned through survival rather than theory. Yet this transition was rarely voluntary. Younger knights watched closely, waiting for signs of decline. Competition never stopped simply because years passed. Respect existed but usefulness mattered more. A knight who could no longer perform risked becoming symbolic rather than essential, and symbols were easy to replace. This fear drove many to push themselves past safe limits, training through pain that should have ended careers earlier. Some succeeded, others collapsed quietly. Injuries that once healed now lingered permanently. Hands stiffened, making fine control difficult. Vision blurred slightly at distance. Balance weakened just enough to be dangerous. These changes created internal conflict because identity was built on capability. To lose physical dominance was to lose certainty. Some knights clung to routine aggressively, refusing adaptation. Others accepted evolution and focused on leadership. Battlefield roles shifted. Older knights held formation, read terrain, anticipated chaos before it erupted. Wisdom mattered here, but glory often passed them by. Songs favored youth and spectacle, not restraint and foresight. Outside combat economic pressure increased. Younger knights attracted patrons more easily. Tournament rewards favored spectacle over consistency. Aging knights relied on reputation rather than novelty. Those without land or secure alliances felt the squeeze most sharply. Retirement was rarely planned. Some knights settled into administrative roles, managing estates or serving courts. Others drifted between minor lords offering experience in exchange for sustenance. A few joined religious orders seeking structure without combat. This choice was not always spiritual but practical. It provided shelter and purpose when martial life became unsustainable. Psychologically, aging brought reflection. Moments once blurred by routine became clearer. Friends lost, risks taken, choices made under pressure. Regrets surfaced quietly at night when activity slowed. Yet pride remained strong. Survival itself was achievement in a profession that consumed many. Early knights measured life not by years but by seasons survived. Still, the fear of irrelevance haunted them more than fear of death. Being forgotten meant failing the identity they had lived by. So many remained involved until the end, advising, training, guarding, serving in whatever capacity allowed them to remain within the structure that defined them. Knighthood did not end cleanly. It faded gradually, absorbed into quieter roles until only habit remained. When the weapons were finally stored and the armor hung untouched, the knight did not suddenly become something else. The habits remained long after the role softened, waking early without reason, listening for sounds that no longer mattered, measuring rooms instinctively. Discipline outlived necessity. This is the final truth of knighthood, rarely spoken. It was not a chapter of life but a permanent transformation. The daily routines of training, duty, restraint and readiness reshaped how knights thought long after their strength faded. Many struggled in quiet ways. Once active service slowed, peace felt unfamiliar, stillness uncomfortable, identity without constant demand felt hollow. The world remembered knights as figures of battle and ceremony but forgot the countless ordinary days that forged them. Days spent training without audience, enforcing order without gratitude, maintaining equipment without recognition. Most of a knight's life passed without song or record, filled instead with repetition and responsibility. Yet it was precisely this repetition that made the system function. Knights were stabilizing forces in unstable times. Their predictability allowed others to live less guarded lives. Even flawed knights contributed to order simply by existing within a known structure. Looking back, many knights understood that glory was fleeting but routine endured. The moments people remembered were brief compared to the years spent preparing for them. This realization brought a form of peace to those who accepted it. Value was not in fame but in consistency, in showing up ready when uncertainty arrived. Legacy was rarely written in names but in systems that continued functioning because someone maintained them daily. This understanding separated myth from reality. Knights were not defined by single heroic acts but by endurance across thousands of ordinary days, waking before sunrise, Training despite fatigue, serving despite doubt, adapting despite aging. And holding themselves to standards that demanded more than the world often returned. When history stripped away romance, what remained was a portrait of discipline rather than spectacle, a life shaped by obligation but sustained by purpose. The knight's true battle was never just against enemies but against chaos, unpredictability and decay, and the weapon used most often was not the sword but habit. This is why knighthood endured for centuries, not because of glory but because men were willing to live lives of structure inside uncertainty, day after day without guarantee of reward. When the armor finally rested, the knight did not vanish. He remained in the order he left behind, in the training he passed on, and in the quiet expectation that when things broke someone would stand ready. This is what a knight did every day, not chase legend but maintain readiness, and that truth is far more powerful than myth.